Thank you. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the bill before us today is the result of efforts from both sides of the aisle to find a solution that really works for industry, government, and our environment. Currently, the Department of Energy has the authority to issue a must-run order to a power provider in emergency cases to protect grid reliability. At the same time, environmental laws and regulations could prohibit a company from complying with a DOE must-run order. So, a company is left in the position of choosing which law it violates, environmental rules or an emergency order from the Department of Energy. In fact, Mr. Speaker, this has happened in the past. During the California energy crisis and as recently as 2005 in Virginia, a company was issued emergency orders by the Department of Energy. To comply with those orders, the company was temporarily in noncompliance with environmental law. Therefore, after complying with an emergency must-run order, the company was both fined and forced to settle a citizen lawsuit. If it happens once, twice, or 50 times, it will never be proper for the federal government to put a company in the position of choosing which law to violate. Reliability concerns for our electric grid are real, and power plant retirements are being announced nearly every week. In June, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation issued their summer reliability assessment. They told us that reserves in Texas are coming up short to meet peak demand, and the California reserve margin will be extremely tight. So, this bill will fix a clear conflict in federal laws with a narrow, targeted approach. This bill will ensure that the Department of Energy will have the ability to keep the lights on while still protecting the environment. The bill before us simply clarifies that if an emergency order issued pursuant to Section 202C of the Federal Power Act may result in such a conflict with an environmental law or regulation, it shall expire not later than 90 days after issuance. This is to ensure that DOE continues to have the necessary authority to keep the lights on in true emergencies. It then gives DOE the opportunity to renew or reissue such an order for an additional 90-day period after consulting with the appropriate federal agencies and including conditions submitted by such agencies to mitigate adverse environmental impacts. DOE may exclude a recommended condition from the order if it determines the condition would prevent the order from adequately addressing the emergency. Mr. Speaker, this bill is the result of many months of work with members on both sides of the Energy and Commerce Committee. It is supported by both the chairman and the ranking member of the committee, and I ask my colleagues to support it also. I want to thank Mr. Olson. It has been a pleasure to work with him on this piece of legislation. It is my hope that all our colleagues will support this legislation. And Mr. Speaker, I will reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I thank my colleague from Pennsylvania for his kind words. And, Mr. Speaker, at this time I see no colleagues on my side of the aisle looking to speak right now, so I will reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is a pleasure for me to now yield as much time as he may consume to the gentleman from Texas, a valuable member of our Energy and Commerce Committee, Mr. Gene Green.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank both my colleague from Pennsylvania and also my neighbor in Texas, Congressman Olson, for making sure we get this bill to the floor today. I rise in strong support of H.R. 4273, the Resolving Environmental and Grid Reliability Conflicts Act of 2012. This bipartisan legislation addresses a longstanding conflict in federal law where a company or an individual can be held liable for violating environmental laws when complying with a federal order to generate power to avoid blackouts. Section 202C of the Federal Power Act gives the Department of Energy the authority to order an electric generating facility to operate to avoid a reliability emergency. At the same time, environmental laws and regulations may restrict the operation of power plants or transmission lines. So if a company or a publicly owned utility is ordered by the DOE to operate under Section 202C, at the same time is prohibited from operating in accordance with the DOE order due to environmental limitations, the operator must choose which legal mandate to follow. These conflicting legal mandates should not complicate an electric reliability crisis. As a longtime member of the Energy and Commerce Committee and someone who has worked on both reliability and environmental legislation during that time, and can honestly say that it was never our intention to put electric generating facilities in a position having to choose between compliance with one law over the other. And while there have only been a couple of instances to date where a generator has been in this situation, the potential for conflict can only grow as several coal-fired plants are scheduled to be taken offline in the coming years. And as my Pennsylvania colleague noted, we have potential reliability issues in my home state and Mr. Olson's home state of Texas. Even though we're under a separate grid, ERCOT, it's important that we have this distinction corrected. That's why Congress needs to address this issue right here, right now, or else we risk threatening our reliability, electrical reliability. H.R. 4273 simply clarifies that if an emergency order issued pursuant to Section 202C of the Federal Power Act may result in a conflict with environmental law or regulation, but the order shall expire no later than 90 days after issuance. This is to ensure DOE continue to have necessary authority to keep the lights on in true emergencies. However, it then goes to the DOE the opportunity to renew or reissue that order for an additional 90-day period only after consulting with the appropriate federal agency, including conditions submitted by the agencies to mitigate the adverse environmental impact. Ms. Speaker, this is not a messaging bill. This is not an anti-EPA bill or anti-air toxic standards bill. Instead, it's a common-sense bill that would address a very worrisome deficiency in current law that only is going to become more prominent in coming years. This is one of the handful of bills that are actually supported by both Democrats and Republicans in the Energy and Commerce Committee. It's also support from the utility industry. That's why I encourage my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support the bill, and I yield back my time. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I still see no colleagues on my side of the aisle waiting to speak, so I'm willing to close if my colleagues are ready to go forward.
Gentleman reserves.
Mr. Speaker, we have no further speakers, so at this time we will yield back our time.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, in closing, H.R. 4273 is a bipartisan, common-sense piece of legislation that ensures that the lights will come on when it's dark, the heat will come on when it's cold, and the air conditioning will come on when it's hot, and lives will be saved. I urge my colleagues to vote for H.R. 4273. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 4273 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arkansas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 897.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 897, a bill to provide authority and sanction for the granting and issuance of programs for residential and commuter toll, user fee and fare discounts by states, municipalities, other localities, and all related agencies and departments, and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Crawford, and the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Larson, will each control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Arkansas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend the remarks and include extraneous materials on H.R. 897.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, because of the geographic area in which they live, many Americans don't have as many transportation options as others. As a result, these people are more directly impacted by highway and bridge tolls than others who live in areas with several transportation options. This bill simply emphasizes that state and local governments have the authority to establish toll programs that offer discounted rates for residents in specific geographic areas. By exercising such authority, state and local governments can mitigate the impact of tolls on residents who have fewer transportation options. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting the legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time.
This gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ask for permission to yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I understand the objective of the legislation before the House today, to clarify the existing authority of public authorities to offer discounts in transportation tolls to residents of communities faced with limited transportation access and heavy toll burdens. Last Congress, the House passed similar legislation. That legislation, at the time introduced by Mr. McMahon of New York, reaffirmed the authority of states and local governments to provide discounted fare or toll rates to residents faced with undue financial hardships imposed by highway and bridge tolls. We recognize that the residents of Staten Island are forced to endure some of the highest toll burdens in the country. The legislation passed by the last Congress would have provided a targeted approach to address the unique challenges facing communities like Staten Island. Unfortunately, unlike Mr. McMahon's bill from last Congress, H.R. 897, as currently drafted, is overly broad and raises some potentially serious legal issues. A number of user organizations, including the American Highway Users Alliance, have raised concerns that H.R. 897 could lead to discrimination against interstate commerce and be used in an attempt to preclude constitutional challenges to an individual toll or fare discount program. Unfortunately, the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure has not held any hearings to examine the potential implications of this legislation. The Republican leadership has decided to bring this bill to the floor with no notice, at least not to this side of the aisle, under suspension of the rules prior to the important issues raised by this bill being examined and, if necessary, addressed. Mr. Speaker, the House should be considering legislation to simply reinforce the existing right of communities to reduce the extreme toll burdens borne by captive toll payers. We should not be considering legislation that could be used to implement programs that impede interstate commerce by encouraging states and public authorities to find ways to shift the burden of tolls to out-of-state residents, or truckers for that matter, or those making longer through trips. Mr. Speaker, not all residential-based toll discounts are fair or necessarily appropriate, but some are. The context and how they are implemented are important to determining if they are appropriate, and unfortunately, as currently drafted, H.R. 897 could be used to remove any case that could be made against a toll discount program. In that sense, it is overly broad and unreasonable. So I would hope that as we move forward, we can address the concerns of the highway user community and ensure that this legislation is not used to preclude challenges to toll discount programs. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Arkansas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to recognize the sponsor of this bill for such time as he may consume, the distinguished gentleman from New York, Mr. Grimm.
The gentleman from New York is recognized for as much time as he shall consume.
Thank you, and I thank the gentleman from Arkansas, and I thank the chair. Just to clarify the record, this bill, which I stand in strong support of, and actually before that, let me just say I want to thank my colleague and friend Gregory Meeks for all of his work on this, and it was a true bipartisan effort. But this bill, all it does is clarify what is already allowed by law. So to say that it's overly broad is it's almost ridiculous, because again, all this does is clarify what's already allowed by law. States and city already have it. There were challenges in courts that have failed, and the purpose of this legislation is to make sure that those frivolous challenges do not continue to go forward. But the Residential Commuter Toll Fairness Act, I feel it's vital to toll discount programs, specifically for my constituents, but through all of New York and throughout this country. I'd like to also thank Chairman Mica, who traveled to my district, to Staten Island, for moving this bill forward and for seeing firsthand in Staten Island the devastating effects and the impacts that tolls can have. And again, this bill, all it does is continue to clarify and allow the states and municipal governments to offer the discounted toll rates to residents for trips taken on roads, bridges, rail, bus, ferry, and other transportation systems. I introduced the legislation for one purpose. It was in response to a 2009 case in which the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit questioned the constitutionality of discounts for residents of towns bordering the New York Thruway. In New York, we simply can't afford to lose our discounts. The majority of my district in New York City is an island. It's Staten Island. And the only way to drive on or off the island is to cross a bridge and pay a toll, something many of my residents do often as part of their daily commute. Without a discount, it costs $13 to cross the Verrazano Bridge. Yeah, I said $13 without the Staten Island residential Easy Pass discount. On the other side of Staten Island going to New Jersey, the cash tolls on 3 bridges have just gone up to $12. 12. And that amount is slated to go up in 2015 to $15. That's without the residential discount. So on Staten Island, we have fought long and hard to reach an agreement on residential toll discounts, which is why this legislation is crucial to making sure we protect those new rates. The Residential Commuter Toll Fairness Act provides clarification only of existing authority for local governments to issue and grant transportation toll, user fee, and fare discount programs based on residential status. It also provides congressional authorization for discount programs. So passage of 897 is nothing more than clarification of what can already be done, and I ask for the strong support of my colleagues. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First, Mr. Speaker, I would just like to enter in the record a letter from the American Highway Users Alliance dated August 1st expressing concerns about the legislation.
Without objection.
Second, I think the gentleman from New York makes a compelling case for why the bill should be more narrowly focused. And third, Mr. Speaker, I may say things on the floor that people disagree with, but I do say my almost ridiculous statements for off the floor and not the floor of the House. Thank you. I yield. And I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Arkansas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I reserve. If the gentleman has nothing further, would
I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Arkansas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this important legislation and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 897? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Minnesota seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 5797 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar number 456, H.R. 5797, a bill to amend Title 46 United States Code with respect to Mille Lake, Minnesota, and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Kravac, and the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Larson, will each control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Minnesota.
Mr. Speaker, I ask the unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to reserve or extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on H.R. 5797.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In March 2010, the U.S. Coast Guard ruled that Mille Lake was a federally navigable body of water based on historical interstate commerce. Specifically, the Coast Guard justified their actions by using a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers determination from 1981 that said because lumberjacks in the 1800s floated logs on Mille Lake down the Rum River, Mille Lake should now be made a federally navigable water body. Currently, the Rum River is dammed in 3 places, and the same Army Corps report said the dams prohibit through navigation. In addition, Two previous Army Corps determinations in 1931 and 1974 also considered the river non-navigable. I'd like to submit the U.S. Coast Guard determination for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now the U.S. Coast Guard is forcing all Mille Lacs Lake fishing guides to spend time and money to obtain a federal boating license. This license and associated costs can run well over $2,000. And according to testimony by the U.S. Coast Guard in the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, they have to travel to Toledo, Ohio, or St. Louis, Missouri, in order to apply for these licenses in person and to take tests. This new U.S. Coast Guard regulation is killing jobs and by making it impractical for some fishing guides to even stay in business and making it even more expensive for tourists to hire their services. The Mille Lacs Lake Freedom to Fish Act removes this burdensome administrative overreach from the U.S. Coast Guard and restores to the state of Minnesota the original authority to permit and inspect vessels. I truly appreciate all the Coast Guard does. I truly do. But the state of Minnesota already patrols Mille Lacs Lake quite well, and the Coast Guard's authority over the lake is an unwanted intrusion. It's duplicative, and it's currently non-existent. This would be a new area of jurisdiction for the Coast Guard, requiring additional assets and manpower. The state has rules and inspection procedures in place to keep its residents safe and has been doing so for as long as anybody can remember. The state is perfectly capable of enforcing boating laws on Mille Lacs Lake, and ultimately Mille Lacs Lake belongs to Minnesotans and should not be controlled by the federal government. We heard from the U.S. Coast Guard on the issue of the Coast Guard subcommittee hearing on May 24, 2011. Rear Admiral Kevin Cook and Deputy JAG Calvin Lederer testified about the burden this would impose on Minnesota fishing guides. Additionally, they were unable to provide adequate justification for the navigability and termination beyond the Army Corps report. My legislation would stop fishing guides from being forced to spend over $2,000 on obtaining a fishing license they simply just don't need. Ultimately, it will allow Minnesotans to focus on what's most important, enjoying one of Minnesota's most beautiful lakes. This has been fully vetted by the Mille Lacs Lake Band of Ojibwe, State and National Association of State Boating Law Administrators. This legislation is also supported by the Minnesota Department of Labor and Industry, fishing guides and resort owners, Minnesota Anglers for Habitat, and Minnesota Outdoor Heritage Alliance. I'd like to submit for the record a letter of support from the Minnesota Outdoor Heritage Alliance.
Objection.
Senator Klobuchar also introduced companion legislation that has been co-sponsored by Senator Franken. In the committee markup, Representative Tim Walz and Ranking Member Rahal lent their support as well, making this truly a bipartisan and bicameral piece of legislation. I'd like to thank Jeff Goslin and John Rayfield for the Coast Guard subcommittee staff for their working with me on the language of this amendment, as well as Tom Dillon from Legislative Council. I'd also like to thank Joe Amato, the Chief Boiler Inspector from the Minnesota Department of Labor and Industry, for providing his guidance and expertise, as well as Mr. Kim Elverum from the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, and George Nitty of Nitty's Hunters Point Resort. Although the text of this bill is short, a lot of work went into making sure that this accomplishes the goals of restoring jurisdiction to Minnesota. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask permission to yield as much time as it may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, H.R. 5797 exempts the owners and operators of small passenger vessels operating on Mille Lacs Lake in central Minnesota from U.S. Coast Guard licensing and inspection requirements. This bill provides rather narrow regulatory relief. However, because this bill was rushed to legislation to mark up without first having a hearing on the bill itself or having the Subcommittee on Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation consider the specific bill, no one can say for sure what consequences might arise in the future. My concerns are somewhat allayed by learning that the state of Minnesota has an adequate program to regulate vessels operating on its inland lakes, including Mille Lacs. Nonetheless, the Coast Guard has expressed concerns that limitations imposed on its vessel safety authorities by this bill could create uncertainty and some confusion among the voting public, especially regarding marine casualty investigations and maritime liability. Notwithstanding these objections, and because the bill as reported would no longer vacate the Coast Guard's 2010 determination that Mille Lake is navigable, I do not object to the bill moving forward today. So I thank the Speaker and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Minnesota is recognized.
I thank my respected colleague for his kind remarks, and I reserve as well.
Gentleman reserves.
With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Minnesota is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I thank very much for having this colloquy today, and I ask my colleagues to join me in supporting this important legislation to Minnesota, and I yield back the balance of my time as well.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 5797 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is agreed to, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Without objection, that's it. Without objection, the title is amended. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arkansas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass Bill H.R. 3158 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 3158, a bill to direct the Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency to change the spill prevention, control, and countermeasure rule with respect to certain farms.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Crawford, and the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Boswell, will each control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Arkansas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend the remarks and include extraneous materials on H.R. 3158.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank members from both parties who joined in co-sponsoring this bipartisan bill that will provide regulatory relief to our family farmers, in particular my colleague, Mr. Boswell. Thank you very much. The EPA-mandated Oil Spill Prevention, Control, and Countermeasure Program, or SPCC, requires that oil storage facilities with a capacity of 1,320 gallons make costly infrastructure modifications to reduce the possibility of oil spills. The regulations require farmers to construct a containment facility, like a dike or a basin, which must retain 110% of the fuel in that container. These mandated infrastructure improvements, along with the necessary inspection and certification by a specially licensed professional engineer, will cost many farmers tens of thousands of dollars. In some cases, compliance costs could reach higher than $60,000 for a single farmer in my district. The SPCC program dates back to 1973, shortly after the Clean Water Act was signed into law. In the last decade, it has strictly come down on agriculture, and the rules have been amended, delayed, and extended dozens of times, creating enormous confusion in the farming community. On top of that, the EPA has failed to engage in effective outreach to producers and cooperatives on SPCC application. In 2009, the EPA lifted a 2006 rule that suspended compliance requirements for small farms with oil storage of 10,000 gallons or less. The rule applies to more than just fuel. In fact, it applies to hydraulic oil, adjuvant oil, crop oil, vegetable oil, and even animal fat. It was scheduled to go into effect this past November. Last summer, I headed up an effort to send a bipartisan letter with over 100 co-signers to EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson, highlighting problems with the program and requesting a permanent fix. At the very least, I requested a delay so farmers impacted by last year's natural disasters would have more time to comply. The EPA responded only a few weeks before the November deadline and issued a statement saying they would not begin enforcement until May of 2013. While we're thankful for that delay, this action still didn't do anything to fix the burden on small farms. It just kicked the can down the road. The Fuels Act is simple. It revises the SPCC regulations to be reflective of a producer's spill risk and financial resources. The exemption level would be adjusted upward from an unworkable 1,320 gallons of storage to an amount that would protect small farms, 10,000 gallons. The proposal would also place a greater degree of responsibility on farmers and ranchers to self-certify compliance if their storage facilities exceed the exemption level. To add another layer of environmental protection, the producer must be able to demonstrate that he or she has no history of oil spills. Mr. Speaker, this legislation is necessary because the existing regulations are not only burdensome to small farmers, they're unenforceable. According to USDA, the current regulations would bring more than 70% of farms into the SPCC regulatory net. This is more than 1.5 million farms in the SPCC regulatory net next year alone. The University of Arkansas Division of Agriculture did a study recently concluding that the Fuels Act would exempt over 80% producers from SPCC compliance. It could save, in my home state, up to $240 million in costs. Over the entire country, it could save small farmers up to $3.36 billion. This year, the ag sector of the economy is facing a crisis. Over two-thirds of the nation is being impacted by drought, and farm revenue has dropped substantially. Food costs are projected to skyrocket for consumers. On top of that, the fate of a multi-year farm bill is still unknown, creating long-term uncertainty for the agriculture community. The last thing the government should be doing right now is imposing a regulation on producers that could cost our nation's family farmers up to $3.36 billion during the next year's planting season. There's absolutely no justification for such an expensive regulation, especially when the EPA cannot provide data or even anecdotal evidence of agricultural spills. By nature of occupation, family farmers are already careful stewards of the land and water. No one has more at stake than those who work on the ground from which they derive their livelihood. I urge adoption of H.R. 3158 and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Iowa is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd give myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Well, Mr. Crawford, I believe that you pretty well covered the detail of this, and I see the gentleman sitting beside you there, and I'm sure he's going to add to it. So I don't think I'll spend a lot of time repeating what you've said, but I want you to know that as a hands-on farmer, producer, I appreciate the effort you put into this to bring this forward, because there are just too many times we see where the farmers in your state, my state, and across the country that are burdened with these extra expenses and criteria that they don't really need, because you know, I know, and I think those of us that are familiar with the farming industry, we are stewards of the land. We don't want to ruin the land. We certainly don't want to ruin the water. So this is a good thing to come forth with this piece of legislation to put a practical sense, a practical application to the situation has been delayed and delayed and delayed. It refers to American farmers. American farmers are very much dedicated to what they represent, and again, those that, as I do, and I'm sure as you do and others, when we have fuel on the farm for whatever reason, to run the tractors, the combines, or the fuel pumps, or the irrigation pumps, or whatever, we're very careful, and the cost of the fuel and the exposure of it being stolen or something is something we don't have a lot of excess sitting around these days anyway. And those that are large operators, seems to me like quite a few of them have got a tank wagon. So I appreciate what you've offered up here, and I'm very supportive of it. And with that, I would reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Arkansas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, thank you, Mr. Boswell, for not only for your support, but your real-world common sense as an ag producer. I appreciate it. I would just like to yield 1 minute? 2 minutes to my esteemed colleague from Oklahoma. Thank him for his patience, and the gentleman from Oklahoma.
Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, and I may not even use all 2 minutes of that, but I do want to be able to just tell the story a little bit of an Oklahoma farm, that the things that they are up against right now are common to farms all across the Midwest. They're dealing with drought right now. They're dealing with the threat of new dust particulate rules coming down from EPA. They just fought through a battle to try to be able to have family farms be able to function with their own kids working on their family farms or their grandparents' farms or their cousin's farm down the road. Is that permissible or not? point source pollution rules that are coming down on them, farm truck distance rules if they want to drive 151 miles in their farm truck and the new regulations they deal with on it, all these different regulations, and then imagine the federal government contacting them and say, on top of all those rules and all those threatened rules, now you need to go find a professional engineer to check out your fuel tank. And we want to send a regulator to be able to evaluate it. And we want you to have a whole new set of rules around your tank as well. It assumes family farms and farmers don't take care of their land. Nothing could be farther from the truth. And a family farm and farms all around the country, these are individuals that they farm that land, they take care of that land, that water is very important to them. Many of them live on well water itself, and so a spill into their groundwater is incredibly important to them for their own personal family as well. They're great stewards of the land. That's how they make their living. In addition to that, they're careful guardians of their storage tank, because that tank itself, if it spills, they lose a tremendous amount of money, and the margins on a farm are not very high. So I'd like to stand with my colleagues as well to say, let's respect the farmer and for what they're doing already on their land, and not send someone from Washington to come check out their farm and check out their tank and to be able to evaluate all those things. Let's allow some trust to the common sense folks in the country that take care of our food and take care of the land and water every single day. So with that, I'd urge my colleagues to support this, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Iowa is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just to say this in closing, we have no other speakers. I feel like we've just defined what the need is. This will be very helpful to the nation's producers, and it's a step in the right direction. So I will urge agreement and support of H.R. 3158, and thank you again for bringing this forth, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Arkansas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, my thanks to the gentleman from Iowa and to those who spoke tonight. And I would just urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this important legislation. With that, yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 3158 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I send to the desk a privilege report from the Committee on Rules for filing under the rule.
The clerk will report the title.
Report to accompany House Resolution 752, resolution providing for consideration of the bill H.R. 6233 to make supplemental agricultural disaster assistance available for fiscal year 2012, with the costs of such assistance offset by changes to certain conservation programs and for other purposes.
Referred to the House calendar and ordered printed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Alaska seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1171 with an amendment.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 1171, a bill to reauthorize and amend the Marine Debris Research, Prevention, and Reduction Act.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Alaska, Mr. Young, and the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Larson, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Alaska.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to provide an extended remarks and include extemporaneous materials on H.R. 1171.
Objection so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, H.R. 1171, the Marine Debris Act amendments of 2012, reauthorize the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, Marine Debris Program at currently appropriated levels through 2015. The program has played a crucial role in preventing and reducing amounts of trash on our beaches and ocean. I think it is important to note that this program is not a regulatory in nature. It takes a voluntary approach to improving the conditions of our marine environment. Failure to adequately address marine debris has major consequences on our economy. Large objects floating in our oceans threaten the safe navigations of cargo ships and recreational boaters. Derelict fishing gear costs commercial fishermen millions of dollars and lost revenues. And debris washing up on our shores force the closing of beaches, a major blow to local economics relying on tourism. In Alaska, NOAA's Marine Debris Program has worked with local partners to collect more than 20 projects that have removed 750,000 pounds of debris from our shoreline since 2006. But the problem of marine debris is about to get worse for Alaska and other Pacific Coast states. NOAA estimates there's 1.5 million tons of debris headed our way as a result of the 2011 Japanese earthquake and the tsunami. Alaskans are already finding styrofoam, plastic, wood, and other lightweight debris washing up on our islands. In May, the Coast Guard was forced to sink an abandoned Japanese vessel laden with fuel oil before it broke open in southeast Panhandle. Reauthorization of the Marine Debris Program is critical to help Alaska and other coastal states protect our economics and ecosystems and ensure the safety of those transiting our waters. I want to commend Representative Sam Farr from California for introducing this bill. As the original co-sponsor of this important bipartisan effort, I urge all members to support the bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask permission to yield as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 1171, bipartisan legislation that reauthorizes the Marine Debris Research, Prevention, and Reduction Act through fiscal year 2016. Just this June on the Pacific coast, an entire 70-foot dock washed up on the coast of Oregon. This is only one piece of the estimated 1.5 million tons of marine debris from the disastrous 2011 Japanese tsunami that will wash up on the West Coast. Disasters like this are why it is so important that we reauthorize this legislation today. Marine debris remains a persistent threat to maritime safety and to the health of our oceans and to our lakes. Thanks to the enactment of the Marine Debris Research, Prevention, and Reduction Act in 2006, we now have a much better understanding of marine debris and its impacts on our shorelines. This law led to the establishment of effective partnerships between the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, and the United States Coast Guard. It has led to better coordinated research and debris removal activities, and it built greater understanding of the challenges we face in addressing this threat. Marine debris is a much larger and growing problem than we first thought, and with the recent disaster in Japan, it will continue to grow. Cleaning up marine debris takes coordination between several agencies and states and requires expensive resources to clean up. Earlier this week, NOAA provided a new analysis estimating that it now costs the agency, on average, more than $4,300 to remove 1 ton of marine debris from the environment. NOAA also said that the dock that washed up on the shores of Oregon will cost $85,000 alone. Despite what we've learned, and despite the fact that states on the Pacific coast and Hawaii will have to contend with 1.5 million tons of marine debris from the 2011 Japanese tsunami for years to come, the majority has insisted on cutting authorized funding levels for this program in half. Now, cutting authorized funding for this program at this time seems short-sighted, and I'm confident that the Senate will insist on the higher authorized funding level in any final compromise bill. But despite those reservations about the reduced funding levels in this bill as reported by the majority, it is imperative that we reauthorize the Marine Debris Act today to address this growing threat in our future. I want to thank the sponsor of the legislation, the gentleman from California, Mr. Farr, for his extraordinary leadership on this issue. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting H.R. 1171, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Alaska is
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to now yield as much time as he may consume to the gentleman from California, Mr. Farr.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you very much for yielding. And I truly appreciate the support you see in a bipartisan fashion here for this legislation known as the Marine Debris Act Amendments of 2012. This bill was first carried and introduced in the United States Senate by Senator Inouye and the late Senator Ted Stevens. And they recognize, as senators from states that are, in a way, from a whole, Hawaii, the entire island, surrounded by ocean, and so much washes up on the shores of the islands, and Alaska, with probably one of the longest coastlines in the United States, certainly impacts from the ocean on them. And that's why it's so nice and wonderful to have my colleague Don Young from Alaska, the only representative in the House from Alaska, to be a strong proponent of this. As he pointed out, Alaska has already seen the consequences of not having reauthorization when the Japanese tsunami has started to wash up. They've spent, in the first wave of the tsunami debris, Alaska has already spent over $200,000 of state money in just aerial monitoring of the local debris from the Japanese tsunami. What this legislation does is, in reauthorization, is allow states to receive grants from NOAA so that the states can deal with their coastline debris problems. It is important we do this for an even bigger purpose, and that is that, frankly, life on land is dependent on the quality of life at sea. And we know that we have, over the years and decades, been dumping everything we don't like on land and can't figure out where else to dump it into the ocean. And at the same time, we take whatever we want out of the ocean. Well, dumping and taking can upset the system so badly that you have oceans dying. And certainly we have big parts of the ocean that are dying because of all the debris and waste that are in the oceans. What this bill does is allow the Coast Guard, working with NOAA, the National Ocean and Atmosphere Administration, to jointly look at, monitor, and figure out ways in which to clean this stuff up. If we don't do that, we're going to suffer. It's like living in pollution in your own backyard. Eventually there are consequences. And I think that those of us who have done ocean legislation over the years, and Don Young has been one of the greater ones to understand it, realize that in solving the problem, it's going to require local action. It's going to require national and international coordination. It's not our ocean alone. It's it goes all over the world, and things in the ocean go. I'll just think of the old stories about bottles and where they wind up. And now we saw with the tsunami that all this Japanese land mass stuff that was washed to sea is now showing up in Alaska and showing up in Oregon, and it's showed up on the beaches in California and in Capitola, where I live. So this problem is also going to require some partnerships between private sector, the fisherman community that knows where some of these drift nets are, and from public sectors. It's going to require innovative technology. You have to detect it. We have found nets that have been left in Monterey Bay that are too heavy to lift out with the conventional craft. We're going to have to go back to the fishing boats and the families who lost those nets and use their fishing boats, which is a private enterprise supported by public know-how of how to retrieve those nets. I think that's very exciting. It's certainly going to require education so people don't keep dumping things they don't want into the ocean. There are consequences for dumping. California is now addressing it in every local community by just stormwater. The fact that all the water that falls on our streets and roads picks up oil, picks up other stuff that isn't compatible with ocean life and washes into it. We have done a lot to clean up sewers and say we're not going to dump that stuff out in the ocean anymore, but we're still allowing other storm waters to get out of there. And so California is addressing this almost community by community. It's how do we stop stormwater and polluted stormwater from getting into the oceans. So this is really this legislation and reauthorizing debris cleanup is much more than just giving NOAA some money to go out there and figure it out. It's really an entire program of figuring out how to keep oceans healthy. So I appreciate the bipartisan support. I appreciate the leadership of Mr. Young, and I appreciate the leadership on the committees. This bill went to 2 committees, the Transportation Infrastructure Committee and to the Natural Resources Committee, and both committees passed it out in bipartisan fashion, and now we have to pass it to the Senate. I hope it's not too late, and I hope Congressman Young will work with me in getting bipartisan support in the Senate so that we can get this bill to the President and get it signed before the calendar year runs out. With that, I yield back the remainder of my time, and thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Speaker, for your patience.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Alaska is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the gentleman from California. Mr. Farr has been one of the leaders in concern with the oceans, and this debris bill is crucially important to the state of California, especially to Alaska. I congratulate Mr. Farr. Came to me many months ago and said, we got to get this done, we got to get this done, and a lot of people weren't interested. And now we finally get to a point where we see what's occurring from the tsunami. We may not have that reoccur again, but the crisis in the ocean is detrimental, as I mentioned in my opening statement, to the fishermen which I represent, the recreational people which I represent, and get it out of the ocean even before it reaches the beaches are crucially important. Beaches sometimes are sort of fun to beach comb, but if there's something bad is in the ocean, we should try to retrieve it sooner than possible, and when it gets there, we really want to be able to take care of it. There should be more money. I won't disagree with the gentleman from Washington. But we're moving this down the road, and we'll see what happens on the Senate side, and we'll see if we can get a little more effort, because it's a partisan, not a partisan, it's a partnership program that makes this thing work. A lot of people have interest in Alaska in trying to clean the beaches after they arrive. We're trying to get more people interested in cleaning the ocean up before it does arrive, and hopefully it will work together. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
No more speakers. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time.
I have no more speakers, so I yield back the rest of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1171 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Ready to go? For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Illinois seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 2446.
Does the gentlelady seek to call up the bill as amended?
The bill's not as amended. No.
Does the gentlelady seek to call up the bill as amended?
No. Probably so. They must have the copy. Yeah. It says as reported.
As reported.
Yes, it's amended. Yeah.
Clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar number 455, H.R. 2446, a bill to clarify the treatment of homeowner warranties under current law and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentlewoman from Illinois, Mrs. Biggert, and the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott, each will control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do have the bill as amended.
Gentlelady is recognized.
All right. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend the remarks and add extraneous material on this bill.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 2446, the RESPA Home Warranty Clarification Act, and urge my colleagues to support the bill. H.R. 2446 is a bipartisan bill that Mr. Clay of Missouri and I introduced last year. The bill has 40 co-sponsors, including 13 Democrats and 27 Republicans. And I thank the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott, for managing this bill. On March 27th, the Financial Services Committee reported out the bill by voice vote. The RESPA Home Warranty Clarification Act would amend the Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act of 1974, or RESPA, to clarify that as long as the consumer or borrower receives specific disclosures about it, a fee paid to a real estate broker or agent related to the sale of a home warranty is not a RESPA violation. When Congress passed RESPA in 1974, it intended for the law to provide consumers or borrowers with timely disclosures related to the cost of real estate settlement services. The title insurance, a flood elevation certificate, and homeowner insurance are a few examples of services required at a mortgage settlement. Unlike these settlement services, a home warranty is not required service. For a borrower or consumer, the purchase of a home warranty is optional. It is a service contract under which a home warranty company provides repair or replacement coverage for a home's system components and appliances. A real estate broker or agent typically acts as a representative for the home warranty company that offers the home warranty, and the real estate broker or agent receives a commission from the home warranty company for presenting the home warranty to the home buyer if the homeowner chooses to purchase the warranty. Congress originally delegated RESPA rulemaking and enforcement authority to the U.S. to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD. For nearly 20 years, from 1974 to 1992, HUD issued no rules or guidance relating to the sale a home warranty by a real estate broker or agent. In 1992, HUD issued regulations adding homeowners' warranties as a settlement service, but was silent on the matter until recent years. Citing no evidence to demonstrate a problem with home warranty-related sales practices, commission arrangements, disclosures, or the product itself between 2008 and 2010, HUD issued an unofficial staff interpretation letter, interpretive rule, and subsequent guidance. In short, after 34 years with no apparent problem with the product that is not required for closing, HUD determined that under RESPA it is a violation for a real estate broker or agent to be compensated by a home warranty company for offering a home warranty to a borrower in connection with the real estate transaction. Mr. Speaker, HUD clearly is seeking to create a solution where there simply is no problem. HUD's unfounded interpretation doesn't follow the letter of the law as intended by Congress. According to witness testimony received by the Financial Services Subcommittee on Insurance, Housing, and Community Opportunity, this misinterpretation of law has resulted in unnecessarily disrupting long-standing business practices that could increase the costs and decrease the availability of home warranties to consumers, as well as unintentionally harm small businesses. H.R. 2446 would clarify long-standing law and practice while restoring certainty related to home warranties in the real estate marketplace. I'd like to thank my colleague, Mr. Clay, for working with me on this bill, and I'd like to thank the gentleman from Georgia for managing this bill. And I'd also like to thank the bill's 40 bipartisan co-sponsors from across the country. I would urge my colleagues to support H.R. 2446, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves the balance of her time. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to encourage all of my colleagues to vote in favor of H.R. 2446, the RESPA Home Warranty Clarification Act. But before I explain exactly why this legislation is so important and vital, let me first take a moment to thank my friend and colleague and my fellow Financial Service Committee member and the sponsor of this legislation, Ms. Bickert, for her hard work on this bill. The fact that this bill passed both subcommittee and full committee by voice vote is a testament to not only the issue's importance, but also to Ms. Bickard's dedication and openness in alleviating members' concerns. Regarding the bill itself, Mr. Speaker, this legislation will help small businesses. It will help real estate professionals. And, most importantly, it will help homeowners by clarifying the law on the sale of home warranties. Congress enacted legislation many years ago to outlaw kickbacks paid in connection with services that must be performed to close a federally related mortgage loan. An interpretative rule released by the Department of Housing and Urban Development has unfortunately created uncertainty about application of the law to home warranties, which are not necessary to close a loan to purchase a home. To eliminate confusion and reduce uncertainty, our bill makes clear that the term settlement services does not include home warranties. This legislation also provides new notice requirements applicable to home service contract companies and to real estate professionals so that prospective purchasers of home warranties are aware that a payment may have been made in connection with the selling, advertising, marketing, or processing or performing an inspection in connection with a home warranty. This simple clarification will allow members of the home warranty industry to pay modest sums to real estate professionals for direct marketing and related services in connection with the sale of a home warranty without a risk of running afoul of a law Congress never intended to be applicable for a completely optional product. This is the simplification of this law. It's very important. It's very simple, but it's very important so that our real estate industry and home mortgage industry can move more smoothly. So please join me in voting for this common sense legislation that will benefit consumers and the small businesses that repair and replace home systems covered by home warranties. And Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentlewoman from Illinois is
Mr. Speaker, I have no further requests for time, so if the gentleman is ready.